All right, I'm going to take this from the top and try again. We are reviewing Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky, Edward S. Sherman. I started this and got a good chunk out of the way on the train from Minnesota to Chicago, but honestly I was a little bit hungover, and the train was a new experience, so it was kind of distracting, and I felt like I didn't totally absorb everything. So I just want to go recap everything that I've already gone through to hopefully get me in the mindset to continue on. So right away in the second paragraph here, in countries where the levers of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy, the monopolistic control over the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that the media serve the ends of a dominant elite. And I'm pause there, and I want to highlight that because this book was originally published in 1988, I believe, and has had a few different editions since then, but I think the last one was 2002. And why I find that interesting is because a lot of that right there is coming up today, but it's the wrong people saying it, and they are the media itself is sort of the agent brushing those claims off as conspiracy, some crazy wild scheme, but I don't know. So the essential ingredients of our propaganda model or set of news filters fall under the following headings. 1. The size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms. So how big is the company, and how much of the population does it serve? How concentrated is the ownership? If a huge media organization has very concentrated ownership, that means a few people are making the decisions that influence the information that is provided to the public, and how that media as an organization will operate and make decisions. 2. Advertising as the primary income source of the mass media. Advertising gets checked pretty hard throughout this book, and it makes sense. When media is dependent on advertising for income and therefore their livelihood, they are going to operate in ways that satisfy the advertisers, the expectations or demands of the advertisers. And demands is a strong word, but being in the advertising world, I understand what it is that he's criticizing right now. It's stuff like brand safety guidelines, where advertisers, the brands, let's say I work for Kimberly-Clark, Kleenex doesn't want to advertise on Fox News because of the type of content that is producing. They're able to get away with this because it doesn't align with what their brand wants. But when media is dependent on advertising revenue, that becomes something that influences the type of content that is produced. 3. The reliance of the media on information provided by government, business, and experts funded and approved by these primary sources and agents of power. This is a big one, and it gets elaborated on and expanded upon later. But this is something that is very, very true today. So increasingly, and the thing is, these and it happens more with a bureaucracy. It's part of the bureaucratic kind of machine, if you will. I don't love describing it like that, but the bigger a corporation gets, right, the bigger its like PR team gets to handle crisis and stuff. But increasingly, there is less direct access and individual or unique time with government officials and things like that, and the media, only in prearranged sort of guided interviews, or there's press releases where certain topics where it's easier for the officials to evade questions and move on to something else or ignore it, where you can only offer up, ask surface level questions without getting into some of the details, stuff like that. We'll get into that more, but it's really, really important. The same goes for the business. And the expert's angle is actually the key, the more eye-opening thing for me. Let's keep going on. 4, flack as a means of disciplining the media. And flack is sort of the backlash for reporting on certain stories. And so it's the criticism from government officials and businesses criticizing the media for covering certain things in the way that they do. And then 5, the last one, 5, anti-communism as a national religion and control mechanism. These elements interact with and reinforce one another. The raw material of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. They fix the premises of discourse and interpretation, and the definition of what is newsworthy in the first place. And they explain the basis and operations of what amount to propaganda, campaigns. The elite domination of the media and marginalization of dissidents that results from the operation of these filters occurs so naturally that media news people, frequently operating with complete integrity and goodwill, are able to convince themselves that they choose and interpret the news objectively and on the basis of professional news values. Within the limits of the filter constraints, they often are objective. The constraints are so powerful and are built into the system in such a fundamental way that alternative bases of news choices are hardly imaginable. In assessing the newsworthiness of the U.S. government's urgent claims of a shipment of MiGs to Nicaragua on November 5th, 1984, the media do not stop to ponder the bias that is inherent in the priority assigned to government-supplied raw material, or the possibility that the government might be manipulating the news, imposing its own agenda, and deliberately diverting attention from other material. It requires a macro alongside a micro, story-by-story view of media operations to see the pattern of manipulation and systemic bias. Huge. And I know I just read at you a ton, but I wanted to capture it. Like, that alone is worth examining. And again, let me come back to this idea, like, a lot of what was just said in there is being said today, and again, it very obvious, for obvious reasons, is being denied in the media landscape for these reasons. And unfortunately, it appears that the wrong people tend to be on the right side of this particular part of the discussion. I just got it hit me that because of this thing, exactly what he is talking about, I have been convinced that everything that was just said, it makes me kind of flinch, right? The elite domination, like these filters, imposing agendas, right? This is something that is, all of those, and those words in particular, are zeroed in on in a way that's freaky. Okay. But notably, and let me get into this, and what becomes more clear through all of this, all of these things have become buzzwords, but they're bigger than their words. And let me zero in on this part. Frequently operating with complete integrity and goodwill. There's a point, and that will come up, where I realized that the problem is not, like the scary types of movements that happen. They don't occur because of bad thinking, evil people. It's flaws in a system, and it's this natural progression, and that it just it happens organically, and you don't really know that you're involved in it until it's there and happening. It's so fucking tricky to explain. Okay, but let's keep going on so I don't make this forever. Size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. The first filter. In their analysis of the evolution of the media in Great Britain, James Curran and Jean Seaton describe how in the first half of the 19th century, a radical press emerged that reached a national working class audience. This alternative press was effective in reinforcing class consciousness. It unified the workers because it fostered an alternative value system and framework for looking at the world, and because it promoted a greater collective confidence by repeatedly emphasizing the potential power of working people to effect social change through the force of combination and organized action. This was deemed a major threat by the ruling elites. One MP asserted that the working class newspapers, quote, inflame passions and awaken their selfishness, contrasting their current condition with what they contend to be their future condition, a condition incompatible with human nature and those immutable laws which Providence has established for the regulation of civil society, end quote. The result was an attempt to squelch the working class media by libel laws and prosecutions, by requiring an expensive security bond as a condition for publication, and by imposing various taxes designed to drive out radical media by raising their costs. These coercive efforts were not effective, and by mid-century they had been abandoned in favor of the liberal view that the market would enforce responsibility. Kieran and Seaton show that the market did successfully accomplish what the state intervention failed to do so. Following the repeal of the punitive taxes on newspapers between 1853 and 1869, a daily local press came into existence, but not one new local working class daily was established through the rest of the 19th century. One important reason, indeed, the eclipse of the national radical press was so total that when the Labor Party developed out of the working class movement in the first decade of the 20th century, it did not obtain the exclusive backing of a single national daily or Sunday paper. One important reason for this was the rise in scale of newspaper enterprise and the associated increase in capital costs. Right, so then they talk about where those prices increased. In 1986, there were some 1,500 daily newspapers, 11,000 magazines, 9,000 radio and 1,500 TV stations, 2,400 book publishers, and 7 movie studios in the United States. Over 25,000 media entities in all. Like, that's crazy. I called that out because I can't really break 6 in each of those categories. That's crazy. And of course, we're seeing the sad demise of local news and local media. But stresses that the 29 largest media systems account for over half of the output of newspapers and the sales and all of those things still. So then they get into some of the financial data. Right. So what happens, right? So they have provide financial information on a bunch of different companies here. But then they get into these 24 companies are large profit-seeking corporations owned and controlled by quite wealthy people. It can be seen in the following table that all but one of the top companies for whom data are available have assets in excess of $1 billion. The median size is 2.6 billion. Right, so major companies making a shit ton of money. Many of the large media, and this is today. We've shifted from there to since post World War II and kind of the rise of modern media. Many of the large media companies are fully integrated into the market, and for the others too, the pressure of stockholders, directors, and bankers to focus on the bottom line are powerful. These pressures have intensified in recent years as media stocks have become market favorites, and actual or prospective owners of newspapers and television properties have found it possible to capitalize increased audience size and advertising revenues into multiplied values of the media franchises and great wealth. This has encouraged the entry of speculators and increased the pressure and temptation to focus more intensively on profitability. The greater profitability of the media in a deregulated environment has also led to an increase in takeovers and takeover threats, with even giants like CBS and Time Inc. directly attacked or threatened. This has forced the managements of the media giants to incur greater debt and to focus ever more aggressively and unequivocally on profitability in order to placate owners and reduce the attractiveness of their properties to outsiders. They have lost some of their limited autonomy to bankers, institutional investors, and large individual investors whom they have had to solicit as potential white knights. The control groups, explains that while the stock of these media firms is traded on the securities market, approximately 2/3 of these companies are either closely held or still controlled by members of the originating family who retain large blocks of stock. But the control groups of the media giants are also brought into close relationships with the mainstream of the corporate community through boards of directors and social links. In the cases of NBC and the Group W television and cable systems, their respective parents, GE and Westinghouse, are themselves mainstream corporate giants, with boards of directors that are dominated by corporate and banking executives. And many of the other large media firms have boards made up of predominantly of insiders. The larger the firm and the more widely distributed the stock, the larger the number and proportion of outside directors. In addition to these board linkages, the large media companies all do business with commercial and investment bankers, obtaining lines of credit and loans, receiving advice and service, and selling stock and bond issues, yada, yada, yada. It may be recalled that from 1965 to 1967, an attempt by International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT, to acquire ABC was frustrated following a huge outcry that focused on the dangers of allowing a great multinational corporation with extensive foreign investments and business activities to control a major media outlet. The fear was that ITT control could quote, compromise the independence of ABC's news coverage of political events in countries where ITT has interests, unquote. The soundness of the decision disallowing the acquisition seemed to have been vindicated by the later revelations of ITT's political bribery and involvement in attempts to overthrow the government of Chile. RCA and Westinghouse, however, had been permitted to control media companies long before the ITT case, although some of the objections applicable to ITT would seem to apply to them as well. GE is a more powerful company, blah, blah, blah. The Murdoch Empire was originally based in Australia, and the controlling parent company is still an Australian corporation. Its expansion to the United States is funded by profits from Australian and British affiliates. The media giants, advertising agencies, and great multinational corporations have a joint and close interest in a favorable climate of investment in the third world, and their interconnections and relationships with the government in these policies are symbiotic. So just to recap that briefly, and I'm going to be doing a lot of just straight up reading, but a lot of the stuff that I skipped over were the nitty-gritty details of the supporting arguments and facts such as types of investments, number of investments, relationships, and mergers, kind of historical backing to support the argument that these media agencies are extremely tied into a network of people with profitability at the core of their interest, and that owning the news or influencing it allows you to sort of stack the cards in your favor. I don't even think he explicitly says that, but more so just, hey, here's all of the ways that these people are connected. Isn't that weird? Kieran and Seaton give the growth of advertising a status comparable with the increase in capital costs as a factor allowing the market to accomplish what state taxes and harassment failed to do, noting that these, quote, advertisers thus acquired a de facto licensing authority, since without their support, newspapers ceased to be economically viable. This is crazy. This part made me really sit down and pause. So before advertising became prominent, the price of a newspaper had to cover the cost of doing business. With the growth of advertising, papers that attracted ads could afford a copy price well below production costs. This put papers lacking in advertising at a serious disadvantage. Their prices would tend to be higher, curtailing sales, and they would have less surplus to invest in improving the saleability of the paper. For this reason, advertising-based system will tend to drive out of existence or into marginality the media companies and types that depend on revenue from sales alone. With advertising, the free market does not yield a neutral system in which final buyer choice decides. That's huge. The advertiser's choices influence media prosperity and survival. The ad-based media receive an advertising subsidy that gives them a price marketing quality edge, which allows them to encroach on and further weaken their ad-free or ad-disadvantaged rivals. Even if ad-based media cater to an affluent, upscale audience, they easily pick up a large part of the downscale audience, and their rivals lose market share and are eventually driven out or marginalized. Huge. So it's not just right. I think the key here, a critical piece of this, of that information, is that the argument isn't really like, oh, it's so unfair as a business practice that, I want to do it the right way and they can just capitalize on, but it's, you cannot compete. You can't put into the resources to become as appealing, have features, attractive format, promotion, etc., to compete against the ad-supported groups. And so this is maybe, hopefully I can kind of capture the way that this sneaks up on you, right? That people, it's not evil at first, because you go into the ad-supported, it's just a way of increasing revenue. But if you take the evolution of ad-supported news from its inception to now, over time, one decision at a time, with each difficult decision on news, content versus profitability, one by one, generation over generation, employee over employee, it becomes the standard perspective change until you reach my generation, where people are like, that's just the way that it is. and whatever. And you can't have the context of what it was like before to understand how bad it really is. One advertising executive stated in 1856 that some journals are poor vehicles because their readers are not purchasers, and any money thrown upon them is so much thrown away. The same force took a heavy toll of the post-World War II social democratic press in Great Britain, with the Daily Herald, News Chronicle, and Sunday Citizen failing or absorbed into establishment systems between 1960 and 1967, despite a collective average daily readership of 9.3 million. This is huge. As James Curran points out, with 4.7 million readers in its last year, the Daily Herald actually had almost double the readership of The Times, the Financial Times, and The Guardian combined. Twice all three of those combined. What is more, surveys showed that its readers thought more highly of their paper than the regular readers of any other popular newspaper, and they also read more in their paper than the readers of other popular papers, despite being overwhelmingly working class. The death of the Herald, as well as the News Chronicle and Sunday Citizen, was in large measure a result of progressive strangulation by lack of advertising support, plain and simple. An alternative framework of analysis and understanding that contested the dominant systems of representation in both broadcasting and forget that last part. The successful media today are fully attuned to the crucial importance of audience quality. CBS proudly tells its shareholders that while it continuously seeks to maximize audience delivery, it has developed a new sales tool with which it approaches advertisers. Client Audience Profile, or CAP, will help advertisers optimize the effectiveness of their network television schedules by evaluating audience segments in proportion to usage levels of advertisers' products and services. In short, the mass media are interested in attracting audiences with buying power, not audiences per se. It is affluent audiences that spark advertiser interest today, as in the 19th century. The idea that the drive for large audiences makes the mass media democratic thus suffers from the initial weakness that its political analog is a voting system weighed by income. Crazy. The power of advertisers over television programming stems from the simple fact that they buy and pay for the programs. They are patrons who provide the media subsidy. As such, the media compete for their patronage, developing specialized staff to solicit advertisers and necessarily having to explain how their programs serve advertisers' needs. The choices of these patrons greatly affect the welfare of media, and the patrons become what William Evan calls normative reference organizations, whose requirements and demands the media must accommodate if they are to succeed. And that got me dark. I've been kind of in a funk since reading that part. That CAP, the client audience profile, the audience profiling and things like that, that's my job right now. I am the villain. How many people recognize that they are a part of one of the major institutional failures of their society? what's worse, and what's kind of explained in this too, is I'm trapped. Trapped. I have very specialized training that is fucking useless anywhere else. You go anywhere else and you need equivalent specialized training, and the cost of obtaining that training is far too great. For a television network, an audience gain or loss of 1 percentage point in the Nielsen ratings, which we still use today, translates into a change in advertising revenue from $80 to $100 million a year, with some variation depending on the measures of audience quality. This is partly a matter of institutional pressures to focus on the bottom line, partly a matter of the continuous interaction of the media organization with patrons who supply the revenue dollars. As Grant Tinker, the head of NBC TV, observed, television, quote, is an advertising-supported medium, and to the extent that support falls out, programming will change, end quote. Okay, so and this is another angle of this too. Working class and radical media also suffer from the political discrimination of advertisers. Political discrimination is structured into advertising allocations by the stress on people with money to buy. But many firms will always refuse to patronize ideological enemies and those whom they perceive as damaging their interests, and cases of overt discrimination add to the force of the voting system weighed by income. This is critical, and this goes back to what I was talking about, the idea in my job of brand safety guidelines, the ability of a brand to choose to opt out of advertising with certain partners. In fact, or media categories. So in fact, a lot of brands are opting out of being associated with the news right now because it's got such a negative tone. And that's kind of across the board, but specifically, and this is, again, where it comes up today and why it's unfortunate. It's like a Chinese finger trap or a boa constrictor. It's tightening. The system tightens because what happens is, yes, the right-wing media today, they are being treated unfairly by these standards, right? Overt discrimination. It's a system that votes with money, and they're overtly being discriminated against because of their ideas and beliefs. And I guess you could say, whatever, it happened to the working class media, good riddance Fox News. Good riddance, whatever. But we can't really afford to consolidate any further than we are right now. But the finger trap comparison, because it is this group that is somewhat unpopular and the beliefs are extremely controversial, it makes standing up for the ideas in this book more challenging because they are being experienced by a problematic group right now. Okay, yeah. Anyway. So public television station WNET lost its corporate funding from Gulf plus Western in 1985 after the station showed the documentary Hungry for Profit, which contains material critical of multinational corporate activities in the Third World. Even before the program was shown, in anticipation of negative corporate reaction, station officials, quote, did all we could to get the program sanitized, end quote, according to one station source. The chief executive of Gulf plus Western complained to the station that the program was, quote, virulently anti-business, if not anti-American, end quote. Classic line from Business. And that the stations carrying the program was not the behavior of a, quote, of a friend, end quote, of the corporation. The London Economist says that, quote, most people believe that WNET would not make the same mistake again, end quote. Expanding on that idea of like selective advertising support, in addition to discrimination against unfriendly media institutions, advertisers also choose selectively among programs on the basis of their own principles. With rare exceptions, these are culturally and politically conservative. Different time. Large corporate advertisers on television will rarely sponsor programs that engage in serious criticisms of corporate activities, such as the problem of environmental degradation, the workings of the military-industrial complex, or corporate support of and benefits from third world tyrannies. So, television networks learn over time that such programs will not sell and would have to be carried at a financial sacrifice, and that, in addition, they may offend powerful advertisers. With the rise in the price of advertising spots, the foregone revenue increases, and with increasing market pressure for financial performance, and the diminishing constraints from regulation, an advertising-based media system will gradually increase advertising time and marginalize or eliminate altogether programming that has significant public affairs content. This kind of goes in hand. There was a big stink recently, or maybe it was just in my head that it was a big stink, but Fox News declared itself an entertainment channel rather than a news channel. That was coming up when they were getting hit with lawsuits for their coverage of the election and the 2020 election and the election denial and pointing the finger at the voting machines. Oh yeah, this is interesting too. Thus, over time, instead of programs like selling of the Pentagon, it is a natural evolution of a market seeking sponsor dollars to offer programs such as A Bird's Eye View of Scotland, Barry Goldwater's Arizona, and An Essay on Hotels, and Mr. Rooney Goes to Dinner. So, on public television, culture has come to mean other cultures. American civilization, here and now, is excluded from consideration. So I guess that's an interesting, part of the consequences of this too. In shaping American culture is it becomes too financially risky to pretty much discuss anything about the U.S. because someone will take issue with that and you'll lose money. And so it's far easier to entertain with what the other countries are doing, and sort of superficially cover the US. Oh, this is where it gets really deep. Sourcing mass media news, the third filter. The mass media are drawn into a symbiotic relationship with powerful sources of information by economic necessity and reciprocity of interest. The media need a steady, reliable flow of the raw material of news. They have daily news demands and imperative news schedules that they must meet. They cannot afford to have reporters and cameras at all places where important stories may break. Economics dictates that they concentrate their resources where significant news often occurs, where important rumors and leaks abound, and where regular press conferences are held. The White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department in Washington, D.C. are central nodes of such news activity. On a local basis, City Hall and the Police Department are the subject of regular news beats for reporters. Business corporations and trade groups are also regular and credible purveyors of stories deemed newsworthy. These bureaucracies turn out a large volume of material that meet the demands of news organizations for reliable, scheduled flows. Mark Fishman calls this the principle of bureaucratic affinity. Only other bureaucracies can satisfy the input needs of a news bureaucracy. Government and corporate sources also have a great merit of being recognizable and credible by their status and prestige. Status and prestige. Those are their only, status and prestige are their only credentials. News workers are predisposed to treat bureaucratic accounts as factual because news personnel participate in upholding a normative order of authorized knowers in the society. Reporters operate with an attitude that officials ought to know what it is their job to know. In particular, a news worker will recognize an official's claim to knowledge not merely as a claim, but as a credible, competent piece of knowledge. This amounts to a moral division of labor. Officials have and give the facts, reporters merely get them. So this relationship and the bureaucratic nature of all of this, it encourages an environment where, again, reporters aren't really reporting. The reporters just assume that the bureaucratic officials are doing what they're supposed to do, and in a sense they are, but it's a very systematic doing, bureaucratic version of it. And that's very much what we're seeing today. If you turn on the news on any given day, there's a great chance that you'll see, a government, official from a press conference room in a very familiar format, right? Or you're going to see coverage of some sort of crime or at the police station, right? The news is very predictable, and it shouldn't be. This is also partly a matter of cost. Taking information from sources that may be presumed credible reduces investigative expense, whereas material from sources that are not prima facie credible or that will elicit criticism and threats requires careful checking and costly research. The magnitude of the public information operations of large government and corporate bureaucracies that constitute the primary news sources is vast and ensures special access to the media. The Pentagon, for example, has a public information service that involves many thousands of employees, spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year and dwarfing not only the public information resources of any dissenting individual or group, but the aggregate of such groups. In 1979 and 1980, during a brief interlude of relative openness, since closed down, the U.S. Air Force revealed that its public information outreach included the following: 140 newspapers, 690,000 copies per week. Airman magazine, monthly circulation 125,000. 34 radio and 17 TV stations, primarily overseas. 45,000 headquarters and unit news releases. 615,000 hometown news releases. 6,600 interviews with news media. 3,200 news conferences. 500 news media orientation flights. 50 meetings with editorial boards. 11,000 speeches. This excludes vast areas of the Air Force's public information effort. Writing back in 1970, Senator J.W. Fulbright had found that the Air Force public relations effort in 1968 involved 1,305 full-time employees, exclusive of additional thousands that have, quote, have public functions collateral to other duties, end quote. The Air Force at the time offered a weekly film clip service for TV and taped features program for use 3 times a week, sent to 1,139 radio stations. It also produced 148 motion pictures, of which 24 were released for public consumption. There is no reason to believe that the Air Force public relations effort has diminished since the 1960s. Note that this is just the Air Force. So that's crazy, and consider abundantly different branches of all of those numbers that I just rattled off. First, consider the tax expense that is required to fund those positions, to have 140 newspapers circulating 690,000 copies per week. But additionally, and more to the point of this book, the influence of that weight of content and distribution, the narrative that they can form about them. And I actually don't understand the film note here. 148 motion pictures, 24 released for public consumption. You know, it makes me curious of whether or not some of the biggest, action war movies are actually just military, like legit coming from the military as propaganda. Top Gun comes to mind, or maybe Band of Brothers is probably a better one. I don't know. So that's crazy. That's just the Air Force. All government branches are going to be like that. In effect, the large bureaucracies of the powerful subsidize the mass media and gain special access by their contribution to reducing the media's cost of acquiring the raw materials of and producing the news. So the news becomes a product, and this relationship is symbiotic because it reduces the cost and access to information for the news companies so they can operate quickly and have 24-hour coverage on all of this stuff and easy access, but on the condition that you have to use the content that is provided you, and you can't spin it or else you might lose that access. And so the suppliers, the bureaucracy supplying the news, help in bringing the cost down, but also get the advantage of spinning the narrative in their favor, and sort of strong arming with the threat of losing support or losing access to that content, and then therefore advertising dollars and stuff like that. Perhaps more important, powerful sources regularly take advantage of media routines and dependency to manage the media, to manipulate them into following a special agenda and framework. Part of this management process consists of inundating the media with stories, which serves sometimes to foist a particular line and frame on the media. Example, Nicaragua as illicitly supplying arms to the Salvadorian rebels, and at other times to help chase unwanted stories off the front page or out of the media altogether. The alleged delivery of MiGs to Nicaragua during the week of the 1984 Nicaraguan election. This strategy can be traced back at least as far as the Committee on Public Information established to coordinate propaganda during World War I, which, quote, discovered in 1917 and 1918 that one of the best means of controlling news was flooding news channels with facts or what amounted to official information, end quote. The relation between power and sourcing extends beyond official and corporate provision of day-to-day news to shaping the supply of, quote, experts. The dominance of official sources is weakened by the existence of highly respectable, unofficial sources that give dissident views with great authority. This problem is alleviated by co-opting the experts. For example, putting them on the payroll as consultants, funding their research, and organizing think tanks that will hire them directly and help disseminate their messages. So think about, and now notice as you're watching the news, how many consultants come on, how many panels they have, and how many times those consultants and panels and special guests are promoting a book, right? And how odd it is that the host of this, the news anchor, agrees with everything that they're saying. Or even the reoccurring guests. That's a big one too. In this way, bias may be structured and the supply of experts may be skewed in the direction desired by the government and the market. As Henry Kissinger has pointed out, in this age of the expert, the constituency of the expert is, quote, those who have a vested interest in commonly held opinions, elaborating and defining its consensus at a high level has, after all, made him an expert, end quote. It is therefore appropriate that this restructuring has taken place to allow the commonly held opinions, meaning those that are functional for elite interests, to continue to prevail. This process of creating the needed body of experts has been carried out on a deliberate basis and a massive scale. In 1972, Judge Lewis Powell, later elevated to the Supreme Court, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce urging business to, quote, to buy the top academic reputations in the country, to add credibility to corporate studies and give business a stronger voice on the campuses, end quote. One buys them and assures that, in the words of Dr. Edwin Fulner of the Heritage Foundation, the public policy area, quote, is awash with in-depth academic studies, end quote, that have the proper conclusions. The proper conclusions is key there. Using the analogy of Procter & Gamble selling toothpaste, Fulner explains that, quote, they sell it and resell it every day by keeping the product fresh in the consumer's mind, end quote. By the sales effort, including the dissemination of the correct ideas to, quote, thousands of newspapers, it is possible to keep debate within its proper perspective. In accordance with this formula, during the 1970s and early 1980s, a string of institutions was created and old ones were activated to the end of propagandizing the corporate viewpoint. Many hundreds of intellectuals were brought to these institutions, where their work was funded and their outputs were disseminated to the media by a sophisticated propaganda effort. The corporate funding and their clear ideological purpose in the overall effort had no discernible effect on the credibility of the intellectuals so mobilized. On the contrary, the funding and pushing of their ideas catapulted them into the press. It's interesting. As I was reading that, I figured out what was meant by that quote by Judge Lewis to buy the top academic reputations. So this was, because this would have happened before my time, it's something that I don't know the before of. And this is where that influence of like, we only hire from this college, or like the institutions themselves, the colleges themselves were sold on this idea. The corporations infiltrated academics in a major way, and we just let it happen, man. As an illustration of how the funded experts preempt space in the media, Table 1.4 describes the experts on terrorism and defense issues who appeared on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour in the course of a year in the mid-1980s. We can see that excluding journalists, a majority of the participants, 54%, were present or former government officials, and that the next highest category, 15.7%, was drawn from conservative think tanks. The largest number of appearances in the latter category was supplied by the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, an organization funded by conservative foundations and corporations and providing a revolving door between the State Department and CIA and a nominally private organization. On such issues as terrorism and the Bulgarian connection, the CSIS has occupied space in the media that otherwise might have been filled by independent voices. The mass media themselves also provide experts who regularly echo the official view. This is a big one. And this is a huge problem that I have too. One, like the government officials being experts in anything is fucking ridiculous, man. They're good at getting elected. They're good at convincing people of things. But as is indicative of the demographics and psychographics, the backgrounds of our Senate right now, these people do not represent an expansive or extremely specialized group of people. Government officials being experts in terrorism is an insane idea. They're preoccupied with so many different things. That's just a fraction of their responsibilities. And the idea of these group, I hate specialization in general as a theme for life anyway, but that's just reinforced here. And again, the experts, right? So they mentioned the CSIS, this organization. The Georgetown Center provided a lot of these experts, right? And it's funded by this organization who kind of dictate the standards of that organization, right? It's the same issue with what's going on in academics in so many places, where information is presented as fact, as true, and to question it is absurd. And that's not anything that we've experienced before, and it's not the opinion of the smartest people in history. Science should be questionable. You're allowed to debate the facts, right? But evidence is evidence, right? And then they make an interesting note on how former sinners whose previous work was of little interest or an object of ridicule to the mass media are suddenly elevated to prominence and become authentic experts just by switching to this the official view, right? So it's the people who, former radicals who come to, quote, see the light. The motives that cause these individuals to switch gods from Stalin or Mao to Reagan and free enterprise is varied, but for the establishment media, the reason for the change is simply that the ex-radicals have finally seen the error of their ways. So it's an interesting thing where they elevate people who had previously thought counter to the mainstream narrative, who have seen the light and changed their position. They're now somehow the experts because they flip-flopped, which is just riddled with flaws and so fucking transparently dumb. Advertisers are still concerned to avoid offending constituencies that might produce flack. Oh, and we've now shifted to the fourth one, which is flack. And their demand for suitable programming is a continuing feature of the media environment. If certain kinds of fact, position, or program are thought likely to elicit flack, this prospect can be a deterrent. So flack refers to negative responses to a media statement or program. It may take the form of letters, telegrams, phone calls, petitions, lawsuits, speeches, and bills before Congress, and other modes of complaint, threat, and punitive action. It may be organized centrally or locally, or it may consist of the entirely independent actions of individuals. So flack is like, it would be the hate comments, on social media and stuff. And so the thing about flack, because I don't want to keep just reading everything, flack acts as a deterrent because again, if you're operating outside the mainstream view, the popular view, you say something controversial to those standards, flack will arise. And in order to protect your integrity and support your claim, that becomes an added expense, and it's harder to regain trust, right? So it's better to avoid flack for financial reasons. And then things like accuracy in media, AIM, these are the corporate community sponsored the growth of institutions such as the American Legal Foundation, the Capital Legal Foundation, the Media Institute, the Center for Media and Public Affairs, Accuracy in Media. These may be regarded as institutions organized for the specific purpose of producing flack. An older flack producing machine with a broader design is Freedom House. The American Legal Foundation, organized in 1980, has specialized in fairness doctrine complaints and libel suits to aid, quote, media victims, end quote. So the Media Institute, funded by corporate wealthy patrons, sponsors monitoring projects, conferences, and studies of the media. It has focused less heavily on media failings in foreign policy, concentrating more on media portrayals of economic issues in the business community, but its range of interest is broad. So it's another one of these arms, right? And so to support the mainstream narrative or whatever, these flack organizations come up. They're usually armed with legal status, and they're funded by wealthy patrons. And so a huge tactic, and this is like Donald Trump's legal strategy always, which is take them to court and bleed them financially in order to defend yourself. You will literally have to pay the price for truth. And these companies will drag you through the mud to do it. Your reputation will be slandered and your expenses exhausted. It's fucked up. So the function of AIM is to harass the media and put pressure on them to follow the corporate agenda and a hardline right-wing foreign policy. It presses the media to join more enthusiastically in Red Scare bandwagons and attacks them for alleged deficiencies whenever they fail to toe the line on foreign policy. Conditions the media to expect trouble and cost increases for violating right-wing standards of bias. I think that this has shifted to left-wing media. We saw the transition of this probably in 2008 with Obama. He was the bridge. And here's the mess. So although the flack machines steadily attack the mass media, the media treat them well. They receive respectful attention, and their propagandic role and links to a larger corporate program are rarely mentioned or analyzed. I want to note that too. The background, the people pulling the strings on so many things, they're rarely mentioned or analyzed. Who owns most of the stocks that you're talking about? That's never mentioned or analyzed. Like following the money going all the way up. The big parent company. They're given op-ed column space, sympathetic reviewers, and a regular place on talk shows as experts. This reflects the power of the sponsors, including the well-entrenched position of the right wing in the mass media themselves. I'm going to try to breeze through some more of this because you get the gist. And so then anti-communism as a control mechanism is the last one. Communism as the ultimate evil has always been the specter haunting property owners, as it threatens the very root of their class position and superior status. It helps mobilize the populace against an enemy, and because the concept is fuzzy, it can be used against anybody advocating policies that threaten property interests or support accommodation with communist states and radicalism. It therefore helps fragment the left and labor movements and serves as a political control mechanism. If the triumph of communism is the worst imaginable result, the support of fascism abroad is justified as a lesser evil. Opposition to social democrats who are too soft on communists and, quote, play into their hands, end quote, is rationalized in similar terms. This still happens, and it's happening today a lot. And so he gets into, and he's so good at making foreign policy easy. They'll basically, the agenda on foreign policy is to be basically anti-communist. That's like our biggest threat, right? And so to do anything in support of that, or that leans that kind of gray area into communist support, allyship, is the worst thing ever. And so they hide behind that while supporting these fascist movements and far right-wing things in foreign policy, and get to do that while pointing the finger about communism. If we analyze their writings, we find all the classic reactions of people who have been disappointed in love, but no one dreams of criticizing them for their past, even though it has marked them forever. They may well have been converted, but they may not have changed. No one notices the constants, even though they are glaringly obvious. Their best sellers prove, thanks to the support of the most indulgent and slothful critics anyone could hope for, that the public can be fooled. No one denounces or even notices the arrogance of both yesterday's eulogies and today's diatribes. No one cares that there is never any proof and that invective is used in place of analysis. Their inverted hyper-Stalinism, which takes the usual form of total Manichaeism, is whitewashed simply because it is directed against communism. The hysteria has not changed, but it gets a better welcome in its present guise. The anti-communist control mechanism reaches through the system to exercise a profound influence on the mass media. In normal times, as well as in periods of Red Scares, issues tend to be framed in terms of a dichotomized world of communist and anti-communist powers, with gains and losses allocated to contesting sides and rooting for our side, considered an entirely legitimate news practice. It is the mass media that identify, create, and push into the limelight a Joe McCarthy, Arkady Shevcheno, and Claire Sterling and Robert Leiken, or an Annie Kriegel and Pierre Dax. The ideology and religion of anti-communism is a potent filter. Okay, I know that this has been long. Let's just bang out the rest here. So then we get into dichotomization and propaganda campaigns. Who else but the shooting down by Israel of Libyan civilian airliner in February 1973 led to no outcry in the West, no denunciations for cold-blooded murder, and no boycott, which is contrasted by the shooting down by the Soviets of the Korean airliner in early September 1983, which permitted an extended campaign of denigration of an official enemy and greatly advanced the Reagan administration arms plans. U.S. officials assert that worldwide criticism of the Soviet handling of the crisis has strengthened the United States in its relations with Moscow. That's contrasted by the Israel scenario where nothing was done. No useful purpose is served by an acrimonious debate over the assignment of blame for the downing of a Libyan airliner in the Sinai Peninsula last week. That was a quote by the New York Times. It's about utility. There's no useful purpose. But in fact, there was a very useful purpose served by focusing on the Soviet act, and a massive propaganda campaign ensued. Propaganda campaigns in general have been closely attuned to elite interests. The Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 served well to abort the union organizing drive that followed World War I in the steel and other industries. The Truman-McCarthy Red Scare helped inaugurate the Cold War and the permanent war economy, and it also served to weaken the progressive coalition of the New Deal years. The chronic focus on the plight of Soviet dissidents, on enemy killings in Cambodia, and the Bulgarian connection helped weaken the Vietnam syndrome, justify a huge arms buildup and a more aggressive foreign policy, and divert attention from the upward redistribution of income that was at the heart of Reagan's domestic economic program. Fucking Reagan. And it always has to meet the utility of the elite interests. Blah, blah, blah. Propaganda campaigns may be instituted by either the government or by one or more of the top media firms. The campaigns to discredit the government of Nicaragua, to support the Salvadoran elections as an exercise in legitimizing democracy, and to use the Soviet shooting down of Korean airliner KAL-007 as a means of mobilizing public support for the arms buildup were instituted and propelled by the government. The campaigns to publicize the crimes of Pol Pot and the alleged KGB plot to assassinate the Pope were initiated by the Reader's Digest with strong follow-up support from NBC TV, the New York Times, and other major media companies. Sometimes they're jointly initiated by government and media, but all of them require the collaboration of mass media. The secret of the unidirectionality of the politics of media propaganda campaigns is the multiple filter system discussed above. The mass media will allow any stories that are hurtful to large interest to peter out quickly, if they surface at all. If the articles are written in an assured and convincing style, are subject to no criticisms or alternative interpretations in the mass media, and command support by authority figures, the propaganda themes quickly become established as true, even without real evidence. This tends to close out dissenting views even more comprehensively, as they would now conflict with an already established popular belief. This in turn opens up further opportunities for still more inflated claims, as these can be made without fear of serious repercussions. Donald Trump is a master of this, and that's why he loves Fox News so much, is he hangs on to certain things and then he reinforces it, and it's this cycle. Similar wild assertions made in contradiction of official views would elicit powerful flack, so that such an inflation process would be controlled by government and the market. No such protections exist with system-supportive claims. Their flack will tend to press the media to greater hysteria in the face of enemy evil. Fucking A. That's that textbook what has just happened. Using a propaganda model, we would not only anticipate definitions of worth based on utility, huge, note this, remember this. If you're thinking of things in terms of utility, that's weird. Using a propaganda model, we would not only anticipate definitions of worth based on utility and dichotomous attention based on the same criterion, we would also expect the news stories about worthy and unworthy victims, or enemy and friendly states, to differ in quality. That is, we would expect official sources of the United States and its client regimes to be used heavily and uncritically in connections with one's own abuses and those of friendly governments, while refugees and other dissident sources will be used in dealing with enemies. Uncritical acceptance of certain premises in dealing with self and friends, such as that one's own state and leaders seek peace and democracy, oppose terrorism, and tell the truth, premises which will not be applied in treating enemy states. So right here, we're getting into the criterion that is used in writing or covering news, depending on whether or not it's an ally or an enemy. And when it's an ally, it tends to be it's the right way plus emotional appeal. And when it's an enemy, it's almost a complete fabrication or a criminally negligent coverage of it. In sum, a propaganda approach to media coverage suggests a systematic and highly political dichotomization in news coverage based on serviceability to important domestic power interests. This should be observable in dichotomized choices of story and in the volume and quality of coverage. And so then in the following chapters, they get into the examples and talk about worthy and unworthy victims. I'm going to summarize this at a high level, but know that the details and the background information in here are solid and convincing. It's basically how it should have been covered originally. One of the things when we're at fault or we're guilty or we are aligned inappropriately, we keep the lid on emotions and evoke regretful and philosophical generalities on the omnipresence of violence and inherent tragedy of human life. What they analyze in depth here is a difference in the coverage of Pope Bieleczko's murder and the trial of his murderers by the New York Times, Time, and Newsweek, and CBS, and then 4 other stories. The coverage of media given to religious personnel murdered in Latin America by agents of U.S. client states. So that all of these people, it's basically the same story. It's religious personnel who were murdered for their religion. And the difference is where it happens. And one of them happens in right, so the 4 ones that get swept under the rug happen in Latin America. So the Poland is the first one. Pope Bieleczko's, he is from Poland, but the angle there has to do with communism, right? And a communist state and standing up to that. And it's crazy. I'll just cover this and then kind of summarize. So that first one, Pope Bieleczko's murder, And by the way, so these dates, 1984, 64 through 78, 1980, March 8, 1980, 1980. Like all of them, same time, almost identical situations, religious people getting murdered for their beliefs in a sort of organized, systematic way, right? Popey, let's go. Number of articles, 78. 1,183 column inches, 10 front page articles, 3 editorials. That was New York Times. Time and Newsweek, 16 articles, 313 column inches. CBS News, number of news programs, 46. Number of evening news programs, 23. I'll just do, okay. The second one, religious victims in Latin America. Number of articles, 8. Front page articles, 1. That's New York Times. Not covered in Time and Newsweek. And not covered by CBS News. Religious murdered in Guatemala. 7 New York Times articles. 2 Time articles. 2 CBS News stories. 16 New York Times articles on Oscar Romero, who, by the way, was a government official defending these, trying to advocate for the truth of these religious murders. 16 New York Times articles, 4 front page, only 3 Time and Newsweek articles, 13 news programs. The total of lines 2 through 5, the ones that got swept under the rug, 57 news articles from New York Times. Time and Newsweek only did 10, and CBS News had 37. Again, this one instance in Poland gets more coverage than all 4 of the other ones combined. And then, so what's interesting is the examination of the ways, like the differences in how these were handled, and then follows up on the background and why. And so, talking about how, with the incident in Poland, there's outrage, indignation, profound shock and mourning, demands of justice be done. They really paint a picture on how gruesome this murder was and all of the details, the way he was murdered, all of these things. And again, it's the backdrop of this, it has to do with communism and what a communist country does to dissenting viewpoints. But again, this is all happening 4 other times in Latin America. The difference being, these are regimes that we are supportive of, allies, we have relationships with. That's where you start to see the generalities, these philosophical generalities, the tragedy of life, and what a terrible thing this was. But not, even though these were arguably even more gruesome murders, talking about 4 nuns who were raped, brutally beaten, their eyes gouged out, shot in the back, like thrown in a ditch, at the direction of their government, who has ties to our ambassador, who is then the media surrogate, and spinning this story in a more positive light than it actually was. And by the way, the 4 nuns, they were Americans. The only reason 3 years down the road some form of accountability and coverage of this happens is because of the relentless flack of the families of these Americans. So there's this other angle of it too, where you can't even argue that the coverage of Poland has to do with the immediate impact of United States citizens. In Latin America, there are examples that directly affected Americans. And Latin America, closer geographically, the threats there pose a more immediate danger to us than in Poland. So again, the more that the layers get peeled back, the more it becomes clear that the coverage of enemies versus allies is extremely skewed, and it begs the question of whether or not the media has a bias. It's a very obvious example of media bias, and how the presentation of the news can elicit different responses as well. In the case of the Poland incident, it created an outcry, immediate consequences, a quick trial, accountability, all of these things. Right, and then in examining these stories, it's actually discovered that the U.S. is guilty of supporting a coup in El Salvador, and that was sort of the reason for the cover-up and the quiet media coverage. And so again, I kind of wanted to breeze through that because I've been talking for a long time. The details in all of that is just profound, but the underlying thing to take away is that there are that's just one example. There are clear examples of ways that the media has been manipulated to elicit certain reactions, to direct responses. That alone is unacceptable. Like, that is not and we just do. Chapter 3, legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. A propaganda model would anticipate mass media support of the state perspective and agenda. That is, the favored elections will be found to legitimize no matter what the facts. The disfavored election will be found deficient, partial, and failing to legitimize, again, irrespective of facts. This is kind of where I'm picking up right now, so I think I'm going to just stop right there and